At 7:18 on a Thursday morning, the main entrance to Ridgeview Estates dropped almost 6 feet. It didn't just crack, it dropped completely. A fresh section of black asphalt folded inward beside the security island, taking a curb, a camera pedestal, and half the visitor lane down with it. A resident approaching the gate actually saw the pavement sag, slammed on the brakes, and backed away mere seconds before the center section violently collapsed. By the time the fire department arrived, a jagged hole had opened beneath the road, and the fact that nobody was hurt was the only lucky part of the morning. HOA President Karen Whitmore stood silently behind the barricade, staring at a crater where her brand-new overflow lane had just been. Just 3 months earlier, she had arrogantly called the sandy drainage strip beside that entrance wasted space, and she had confidently ordered it paved. My name is Daniel Brooks. I was 51 years old, and I owned 14 acres on the hillside immediately west of Ridgeview Estates in eastern Tennessee. The strip Karen paved never looked important to the untrained eye. It was shallow, sandy, and covered with coarse grass and gravel. Most of the summer it looked almost completely dry, but it was absolutely not an abandoned ditch. It was a natural infiltration swale that had spent decades intercepting hillside seepage, spreading stormwater, slowing runoff, and letting part of it soak safely through the sandy soil before ever reaching the HOA entrance. I had explicitly warned the board in writing. Their own contractor had raised a drainage question, and their civil engineer had formally proposed an engineered replacement. The original subdivision plans had even stated it in plain language: maintain the existing sandy swale as a distributed infiltration area. Karen rejected the replacement because it added $38,000 to the project, and her email later became one of the most astronomically expensive sentences Ridgeview ever produced. We are not spending another $38,000 to drain sand, pave it, and finish the entrance. After the collapse, county engineers discovered something else lurking beneath the gate. The site sat over weathered limestone with localized void potential, and an old storm pipe connection near the security island had also separated. The geology had always been there, and the pipe defect had probably existed for years, but the old swale had safely distributed that water across a broad area. The new pavement and curb concentrated much more of it dangerously near one vulnerable point. Karen had spent months publicly saying the ditch did nothing, right up until the entrance directly above it disappeared. I bought my property 17 years earlier, and my house sat halfway up a wooded slope, with 2 old pasture terraces below it, and a gravel equipment road curling gently toward the county road. My father helped me clear the upper field before his health declined. He was the kind of man who could look at a hillside after rain and tell you exactly where the ground would stay soft for 3 days. He never formally called it hydrology. He just watched the water. After he died, I kept most of the land exactly the way we had originally planned it. I repaired commercial HVAC systems for a living, which meant dealing with pumps, drains, condensate, pressure, flow, and a lot of crawling into dark places where somebody had foolishly ignored water until it became incredibly expensive. I was absolutely not a civil engineer, and I was not a geologist. But I had learned one crucial principle that applied almost everywhere. If water has been using the exact same route for years, you better deeply understand that route before you attempt to block it. The sandy swale became entirely obvious to me during my very first wet spring. After several days of heavy rain, water would begin naturally seeping out of the hillside above it. Not rushing, just steadily seeping. The strip safely spread that gentle flow across a wide, shallow area, allowing some to naturally soak into the sandy soil, while the rest moved slowly toward the lower drainage network. It never looked dramatic, and that was exactly why ignorant people consistently underestimated it. When Ridgeview Estates was originally built next door, the developer's civil engineer intelligently noticed that exact same feature. Instead of recklessly filling it in, Their grading plan strictly preserved it along the western edge of the future entrance, deliberately designing the pavement completely around it. For years, nobody cared about it, until Ridgeview rapidly grew from 200 homes to more than 250. Delivery vans hopelessly stacked up near the visitor call box, and frustrated residents fiercely complained that school pickup traffic and contractor vehicles constantly clogged the entrance. Karen Whitmore proudly became HOA president after heavily campaigning on sweeping infrastructure upgrades and better neighborhood security. Her signature crowning achievement was meant to be a fully redesigned entrance, featuring a new stone monument, new security cameras, a wider resident lane, a separate visitor lane, and a crucial overflow strip for busy periods. Unfortunately for everyone, the easiest geometric place to fit that new overflow lane was directly over the natural sandy swale. I did not blindly oppose the entrance project itself. I simply attended one site meeting because the proposed grading came uncomfortably close to my property line. I calmly told the project manager that the low strip carried significant hillside seepage during prolonged rain, and he assured me the engineer was actively reviewing the drainage. That sounded entirely responsible, until a week later, when I finally saw the revised rendering. The swale was completely gone, and in its place was solid asphalt. I immediately emailed Karen, the property manager, and the paving contractor, attaching clear photos from previous wet seasons and a copy of an old grading sheet I had received at closing. I asked them one incredibly simple question. What exactly was replacing the lost infiltration function? Nobody ever answered me directly. Karen simply wrote back that the project had been professionally designed and that Ridgeview needed to eagerly move forward. That was the exact moment I realized she viewed my technical concern as hostile opposition rather than vital information. If you own property near a subdivision, road, ditch, retaining wall, or drainage feature, you need to ruthlessly keep the old plans if you can get them. The ugliest, most boring strip of land on a site can silently be doing the most important job. If you know somebody dealing with a severe drainage or HOA construction dispute, share this story with them, because catastrophic problems like this rarely begin with a giant hole in the ground. They begin with somebody arrogantly deciding a small natural feature does not matter. I honestly still thought the licensed engineer would catch the glaring error, but then the heavy machines finally arrived. Construction officially started in April, with workers quickly stripping the coarse grass from the swale before removing part of the sandy layer and placing a compacted stone base. I meticulously photographed the work from my side of the boundary, but since the contractor was not trespassing, I legally had no reason to interfere. But after just 2 days, I noticed something missing that deeply bothered me. There was absolutely no perforated pipe, no stone infiltration trench, and no underdrain being installed. There was absolutely nothing that looked like an engineered substitute for the broad infiltration area they were permanently covering. I immediately sent another email, and this time the property manager finally replied with a formal change order summary that explained almost everything. The civil consultant had originally specified a robust alternate drainage system under the new overflow lane, featuring a stone infiltration trench, a perforated underdrain, multiple cleanouts, and a highly controlled overflow connection. The estimated cost for that critical system was $38,000, and the board had ruthlessly deleted it. Attached to the contractor file was a blazing request for information that stated, "Removal of existing infiltration swale strictly requires alternate subsurface drainage. Please confirm final design." The licensed engineer had answered by clearly referencing the proposed underdrain, but then Karen arrogantly approved a value-engineered revision, completely eliminating that component. Her email command was brutally simple. "We are not spending another $38,000 to drain sand. Pave it and finish the entrance." The contractor then placed a rigid concrete curb along the new lane, which maliciously changed the drainage dynamics even more. Heavy water that once peacefully spread into the sandy strip would now violently run along a completely impervious edge, funneling directly toward a single catch basin near the security island. I formally asked the board to simply have their civil engineer certify the revised configuration, not to redesign the whole project, but just to certify that the final budget-cut version still handled the hillside seepage safely. They never sent me that certification, and instead, the shiny new lane proudly opened in May. For several weeks, the weather stayed mostly dry, and the entrance honestly looked beautiful, with its fresh blacktop, crisp new striping, towering stone columns, and vibrant landscaping. The official HOA newsletter proudly called it a highly successful modernization, and Karen even arrogantly told a neighbor that my technical concerns about the ditch had been massively exaggerated. Then June finally brought the heavy rain. The first storm was moderate, the second lasted most of a day, and the third came just 3 days later. It was nothing record-breaking, just repeated steady rain on a steep hillside that was already saturated. I walked my lower field after the second storm and clearly noticed muddy water ominously appearing along the uphill edge of the brand-new pavement. After the third storm, the catch basin near the gate was still heavily receiving flow hours after the actual rain had stopped. That clearly told me the hillside seepage had not miraculously disappeared. It had simply found the destructive new route the careless project gave it. I carefully photographed the standing flow for my records, and the very next day, one of Ridgeview's maintenance workers sent me a disturbing picture showing a shallow depression that had physically formed in the visitor lane. The fresh asphalt looked visibly dished inward, and there was a thin, menacing crescent-shaped crack rapidly forming near the concrete curb. I strictly told him to send it to the property manager and demand an engineer, which he formally did, but the HOA maintenance simply patched over the crack. Just 2 days later, the automated gate arm began sitting noticeably out of level, and instead of safely closing the lane, they just mechanically adjusted the arm. That evening, I sent one final email stating that settlement near a storm inlet, after repeated rainfall, absolutely must be investigated before vehicles continued driving over the area. Karen dismissively responded that maintenance had inspected the pavement, and there was no emergency. The very next morning, the asphalt violently dropped. The catastrophic collapse changed the entire mood of the neighborhood immediately. Firefighters swiftly closed the main entrance. Police aggressively redirected all traffic to Ridgeview's much smaller west gate. The county stormwater office formally sent out an inspector, and the HOA insurer desperately notified a geotechnical firm. I hired my attorney, Rachel Sloan, that exact same afternoon, not because the hole was on my property, because it certainly was not. I hired her because the massive volume of water from the failed entrance was now actively bypassing the destroyed drainage and spilling aggressively toward my lower field. Emergency crews had also begun openly discussing digging temporary diversion channels uncomfortably close to my boundary, and I wanted absolutely everything legally documented before their frantic repair work permanently changed the site. Rachel instantly sent a strict legal preservation letter to the HOA, demanding all construction drawings, change orders, internal board emails, contractor requests for information, inspection notes, maintenance photographs, and stormwater records. While she aggressively requested the county permit file, I went hunting for the oldest original development documents I could possibly find. The original geotechnical appendix vividly described the entrance area as weathered limestone terrain featuring localized solution features and potential voiding. That sounded incredibly alarming until the engineer calmly explained it. It didn't mean the entire neighborhood was sitting over one giant movie-style cave. It simply meant the local geology required extremely careful water management, because highly concentrated infiltration could sometimes enlarge hidden subsurface pathways or actively move fine soil into existing bedrock fractures. Then we struck gold and found a glaring note printed right on the original grading plan, commanding in bold letters, "Do not concentrate hillside seepage at east entrance." Another original sheet clearly identified that exact sandy strip as a heavily protected distributed infiltration area. Those technical documents were nearly 15 years old, meaning the project engineers who wrote them had never known Karen, they had never known me, and they had absolutely no reason to take sides in a modern dispute. They had simply and scientifically documented the harsh reality of the site conditions. Then, the contractor's daily field records added another damning piece to the puzzle. During the initial excavation for the new entrance, workers had accidentally exposed an older storm pipe connection right beside the security island, and a specific field note mentioned finding unusually damp soil around one of the joints. The construction superintendent had actually requested a thorough camera inspection before the heavy new pavement covered the area, but the critical request was cheaply deferred just to avoid delaying the precious paving schedule. After the massive collapse, a camera finally went inside that pipe and proved that the joint had completely separated, actively allowing water to silently escape into the surrounding soil. That critical discovery gave Karen a desperate new defense. She loudly argued that because the pipe was old and the geology was natural, the massive collapse was completely unavoidable and would have happened eventually anyway. However, the lead geotechnical consultant firmly refused to say that, just as he accurately refused to say that the new pavement alone magically caused the hole. What he scientifically described was a deadly chain reaction, a vulnerable geologic setting, an existing pipe defect, repeated heavy rainfall, and a disastrous drainage modification that ruthlessly concentrated much more water near the exact hidden area where the defect existed. Fine soil had steadily migrated into the deep subsurface fractures and openings until the structural support beneath the pavement fatally weakened, causing the surface to violently collapse. It was mechanically closer to severe soil piping and cover collapse than it was to some mysterious natural cavern opening without warning. Rachel then legally obtained the internal board minutes from the exact meeting where the drainage alternate had been formally rejected. The licensed engineer absolutely did not say the underdrain was unnecessary. The arrogant board simply removed it to save a quick buck. The contractor had explicitly asked for confirmation. The stark warning had been fully documented, and Karen had ruthlessly pushed the reckless project forward anyway. At that specific point, the legal case stopped being about whether nature simply played a role, because of course nature played a role. The ultimate legal question became whether the HOA had materially and negligently increased the risk after being explicitly told exactly how the complex site worked. The strict county immediately ordered the main entrance firmly closed until full geotechnical stability could be properly evaluated, legally mandating that no permanent reconstruction could begin without a fully approved drainage and stabilization plan. Frustrated Ridgeview residents were endlessly forced to use the narrow west gate, causing massive morning traffic backups, and leaving heavy delivery trucks hopelessly struggling to turn around. The highly expensive project that had been built specifically to eliminate congestion had now catastrophically created much more of it. Then the preliminary geotechnical report finally arrived, officially identifying several layered contributing factors: the weathered karst-prone limestone, the separated storm pipe joint, the saturated hillside conditions, and most importantly, the recent dangerous conversion from safe distributed infiltration to intensely concentrated runoff. One single sentence permanently changed the entire insurance discussion. The entrance modification materially increased water concentration in the vicinity of the existing storm connection. That was not the same as saying the HOA magically created a sinkhole out of nothing. It was actually much stronger because it was scientifically precise. The geology was already there. The pipe problem was already there. But the HOA recklessly changed the water pattern in the exact way its own historical records had warned against. Rachel brilliantly placed 4 critical documents side by side on her conference table for me to physically see. The original development plan explicitly said to preserve the distributed infiltration, while the engineer's project note heavily demanded alternate subsurface drainage. Next to that was the board's reckless revision, demanding the removal of the swale for full asphalt. And finally, Karen's arrogant email commanding them to just pave it and finish the entrance. The entire indisputable story of liability was sitting right there in just 4 pieces of paper. Then a severe secondary issue rapidly emerged, as the new concrete curb and destroyed overflow lane had unfortunately redirected emergency runoff aggressively toward the edge of my parcel after the collapse. County staff officially documented active erosion beginning dangerously near my fence line, and Rachel instantly sent a formal legal demand requiring Ridgeview to fully control that destructive runoff during the entire reconstruction process. The HOA could absolutely no longer dismiss me as just some annoying neighbor complaining about visual aesthetics, because their failed drainage modification was now actively and illegally affecting adjacent property. Outside counsel strictly advised the cornered board to stop making any public statements blaming the incident solely on natural geology until the full engineering review was formally complete. Karen absolutely hated being silenced, but the angry insurer hated undocumented public claims even less. And once the coverage team finally saw the written engineer warning, the contractor request for information, the cheaply deferred pipe inspection, and Karen's own damning email, the terrifying financial reality became incredibly obvious. The only remaining question was exactly how much of this catastrophic loss would have been completely avoidable if the arrogant board had simply followed the professional technical recommendations before paving. The massive mandatory repair brutally began with deep investigation, not cheap asphalt. Boreholes were aggressively drilled all around the collapsed lane so engineers could accurately map the hidden loose zones deep beneath the entrance. The failed storm connection was heavily excavated. The fully separated pipe section was carefully replaced, and wherever the geotechnical plan specifically called for it, the massive voided areas were painfully stabilized using engineered fill and highly targeted pressure grouting. The strict county required flawless technical documentation at absolutely every single stage. Then, painfully, came the exact comprehensive drainage system that Karen had originally tried so hard to avoid paying for. A robust subsurface collection line went deep beneath the rebuilt edge. A heavy stone infiltration trench ran along a major part of the entrance, and multiple cleanouts were permanently added for future inspection. The rigid concrete curb was completely redesigned so that heavy water would absolutely not funnel violently toward one single catch basin. Most importantly, a beautifully landscaped bioswale was legally restored right along the side of the lane to properly recreate a significant part of the distributed infiltration function that the original site had naturally provided. The final solution was not identical to the old sandy ditch. It was an expensive engineered equivalent. That was the entire point of the dispute. You absolutely could improve the entrance, but you legally had to replace the critical physical function you ruthlessly removed. The paving contractor happily produced its earlier request for information, fully avoiding taking any primary legal responsibility for the board's disastrous drainage deletion. The civil consultant comfortably produced its original comprehensive design, and the furious insurer heavily questioned whether massive parts of the cleanup costs actually fell outside of ordinary coverage, simply because the negligent board had undeniably received explicit written warnings before maliciously approving the cheaper revision. The panicking HOA was forced to hire separate coverage counsel, and absolutely nobody was discussing saving $38,000 anymore. The astronomical bills rapidly piling up now included emergency barricades, 24-hour traffic control, deep geotechnical drilling, heavy pipe replacement, massive excavation, underground stabilization, full stormwater redesign, new poured concrete, brand new pavement, entirely new landscaping, extensive legal review, and months of temporary access management. The catastrophic final total moved well into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. At the very next Ridgeview board meeting, furious residents completely packed the clubhouse walls to the breaking point. Karen pathetically tried to explain to the angry crowd that absolutely no engineer could have perfectly predicted the exact collapse. While it was technically true that nobody had specifically predicted a massive 6-foot crater opening beside the gate on a Thursday morning, a furious homeowner stood up and asked a much better series of questions. Had the engineer explicitly warned against concentrating water there? Yes. Had the contractor actively asked about the required replacement drainage? Yes. Had the arrogant board deliberately deleted the vital $38,000 system? Yes. Had the president literally written in an email to just pave it and finish the entrance? Yes. The entire packed room went dead quiet. The residents were not furiously angry because Karen simply failed to perfectly predict the future. They were out for blood because the board had specifically paid highly trained professionals to identify a major risk, and then arrogantly treated the mandatory solution like it was just an optional aesthetic decoration. A fierce recall petition aggressively began within days, forcing a humiliated Karen to quickly resign in disgrace long before the final vote could even happen. The shaken interim board immediately adopted an ironclad new capital project rule, stating that absolutely any field change involving stormwater, retaining structures, steep slopes, drainage corridors, underground utilities, or subsurface conditions legally required explicit written approval from the responsible design professional. No rogue board officer could ever again illegally remove a vital technical component simply to maliciously meet a budget or a rushed schedule without fully documented engineering review. The rule sounded incredibly obvious, but it forcefully existed because the arrogant old board had painfully proved that simple common sense was just not enough. The main entrance finally reopened a grueling 11 weeks after the catastrophic collapse. It honestly still looked incredibly expensive, featuring sleek new asphalt, a beautifully rebuilt security island, a perfectly straight automated gate arm, and vibrant fresh landscaping. But right along the western edge was a shallow, carefully planted channel, densely filled with heavy stone, native deep-rooted grasses, and specially engineered soil. Most clueless residents probably just saw pretty decorative landscaping, but when I looked at it, I saw highly functional, professionally engineered water management. During the very first heavy rain after the grand reopening, I carefully walked down to check my lower field. The heavy water safely spread through the robust new bioswale, instead of rushing violently toward the security gate. The concrete catch basin definitely flowed, but it was safely not carrying absolutely everything at once. The deeply repaired storm line stayed perfectly intact, and most importantly, my vulnerable fence line stayed completely dry. Rachel successfully negotiated a full reimbursement for the expensive drainage assessment and legal expenses I had forcefully incurred after the destructive runoff from their failed site had illegally crossed toward my parcel. I absolutely did not ask for some massive, dramatic payout. I simply wanted my land completely protected and the dangerous drainage permanently fixed, and getting exactly that was more than enough for me. I truly never enjoyed seeing Ridgeview's expensive new entrance violently collapse. An innocent person could have easily been driving directly over that fragile pavement when it catastrophically failed, and a massive 6-foot sinkhole simply does not care who was technically right in a petty email argument. What deeply stayed with me for years was just how incredibly preventable the entire hostile conflict had always been. The arrogant board absolutely did not lack vital information. They had the original plans. They had a licensed civil engineer. They had a paving contractor actively asking a safety question. They had an old explicit geotechnical warning. And they even had my clear photographs proving the swale actively carried water. What they fatally lacked was simply the patience to accept a scientific answer that cost slightly more money than a cheap layer of asphalt. If you own any property with an old ditch, culvert, swale, hidden drain, retaining wall, weird gravel strip, or buried pipe that looks totally pointless, you better find out exactly what it actually does before you arrogantly attempt to remove it. Water is incredibly patient, and it will relentlessly obey the strict laws of gravity long after a foolish HOA board meeting officially ends. Tell me in the comments whether you think Ridgeview completely crossed the legal line when it recklessly rejected the engineered drainage system just to save $38,000. Share this story with someone currently dealing with hostile HOA construction or severe drainage problems. Save this video if you ever want to remember exactly why old grading plans can legally matter, and heavily subscribe for more property rights stories where hard evidence, strict engineering, and one single ignored document changes absolutely everything. They arrogantly thought the natural sandy swale was just wasted space, but the original civil engineer always knew it was the absolute only place that the heavy water desperately needed to go.